right, well, thanks everyone for coming out in the rain. Today is the Thursday, November 16, 2017 session in our series of lectures on the rise of commercial space businesses in Asia. I'm Richard Dasher. I direct the U.S. Asia Technology Management Center. And at the last minute, the company we were trying to get to speak today couldn't do it. And so I decided that it would be a good opportunity for me to come in and give you some market information and sort of more of a real discussion of the business side of commercial space businesses. So what we'll do is really talk about how space industries worldwide are structured, what kind of dynamics you see. As we'll see, they really focus on satellite services right now. We'll talk a little bit about the changing roles of governments and also the growth of the private sector. Then we'll focus on Asia. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about the dynamics of space industries from now. So if you look at the big picture, the total size of space industries revenues, this is sometimes called the space economy, is calculated in 2016 as $339 billion. Just by comparison, does anybody know how big the semiconductor industry is? About 377 billion. So the space industry's revenues is roughly equivalent to the size of the semiconductor industry. But in this past year, the semiconductor industry grew by 11%. And if you see the top line up here, space industries only grew by 1.1% between 2015 and 2016. Now, that covers quite a bit of variation between some things that are growing and some things that are not growing. But I have to, first of all, point out something that's really odd in the sources that I was looking at. They're under non-satellite industry. The amount dropped from 127 billion to 78 billion between 2015 and 2016. And the amount shown under ground equipment rose from 58.9 billion to 113 billion. Something strange is going on because that doesn't match what the source said in terms of growth rate. However, that's what they have reported, and they reported a number of times in this report, which was prepared for the Satellite Industry Association. This is a yearly report that's about 50 or 60 pages long and has a lot of good data. But I suspect maybe there was a reclassification of some things from non-satellite industry into ground equipment. The non-satellite industry is not really well defined in their report. I would expect it to include things like financing activities and insurance. And actually, you may be interested to know that insurance premiums for space-related activities in 2016 were about $700 million. So that's not 50 billion, but it's 700 million, which is not to be sneezed at. Unfortunately, a couple of years before that, payouts by insurance companies for space-related losses were over 600 billion. So it's only about $100 billion profit. Anyway, as you see from this slide, space industries really focus on what you can call the satellite industry. Satellite services, satellite manufacturing, launch services, and ground equipment. And we'll talk more about those as we go along. The total size of those four elements is about $260 billion last year, and the U.S. had about $110 billion out of that. So the majority of space industries, satellite industries' revenues is already outside the United States. Yeah, this is basically what I was just talking about. So if you look at the satellite services line from the big picture, that total was $127 billion in 2016. That's 0.2% bigger than it was in 2015, which is not very interesting growth. But historically, if you go all the way back to 2012, the previous years represent 4 or 5% a year growth, which for an industry segment that size is pretty big. The U.S. did not have the majority of the services sector. It had about 41% of the satellite services revenues this past year. Now, the satellite services can be divided into consumer, fixed, mobile, and Earth observation. The consumer areas are where you see the greatest growth. And especially satellite TV services has been growing quite nicely, thank you. There are now more than 220 million people who subscribe to pay TV using satellite, and this is worldwide. And even more people who get free satellite TV services depending on certain locations. Growth in the satellite TV sector is really being driven by emerging markets. They're leapfrogging. People do not have cable in the ground, and so it's much cheaper to have a satellite and send down the signal from satellite. But for the satellite industry itself, the growth in satellite demand may actually slow because compression technologies keep getting better. So you can send out more data without having more satellite bandwidth. Also, there is a lot more wireless internet down here on the ground. In fact, one of the issues that we'll see has to do with competition over certain areas of spectrum. The fixed satellite services, this is the old style stuff. This is the big telephone companies that are using satellite. This is the giant TV news going from the reporters back to the central TV station. That's the fixed transponder agreements. The managed services is actually an interesting sector, even though it's small, 6.2 billion, that's growing quite nicely because of in-flight communications. They're using satellite communications if you're using Wi-Fi over, while you're flying across the Pacific or even while you're flying across the U.S. So they're charging a lot for this, but hopefully as the demand goes up, the price per minute will go down. The mobile is really communications, old-style satellite phones, other maritime communications, air-to-ground communications. That's the kind of thing that's in the mobile sector. And that's also shown quite a bit of interesting growth. And finally, we get down to Earth observation, which is a specific segment of the satellite services industry. It's growing quite well, and it's expected to grow a lot more. More than half of all of the satellites that were launched in 2016 were Earth observation satellites, including all of the CubeSats and most of the other microsatellites. So that's these notes. The satellite manufacturing is the second big line in the satellite industries column. And you see a drop in revenue between 2015 and 2016. The main reason is a drop in the number of satellites. I've got a chart that follows where there were 126 satellites launched in 2016. The pie chart part of this, though, is not number of launches or number of satellites. It's the value of the satellites. So, right now there's not quite 1,500 satellites in operation that people talk about. And of these, a third of them are American. There's 140 Russian satellites, quite a few, 181 Chinese satellites, but also a third of the satellites are from other nations. And what is going on is that there are fewer satellites, and the number of small satellites has actually increased quite a bit. The number of very small satellites being put into orbit has really jumped up since about 2013. And this includes CubeSats, the bottom part of that bar graph, which are really satellite kits. They're standardized modules and standardized form factors, and they can either be launched from the ground, or over half of them were sent up in the payloads to the International Space Station and then sent into their independent orbits from the International Space Station. All of the 45 CubeSats that were launched in 2016 that were commercial were for Earth observation. So going back to this line, really fewer satellites were launched in 2016. The launch services is the second big part of this. In the second big part of this manufacturing and launch services, you see relatively flat revenues year to year. It's really averages about $5.5 billion or less or more. The year-to-year variation really has to do with the fact that geosynchronous satellite launches are big billion-dollar projects. So if you have one or two satellites difference in number, it will really make a difference in the revenues. The U.S. is consistently less for the last 5 years than other countries. Remember, the French started doing Arianespace a long time ago. The Indians have been doing launches. If we look at what's going on, there were 11 Arianespace launches in 2016. The Chinese had 20 launches for commercial payloads, but they yielded less revenue than they did in 2016. The satellites are getting smaller and the launch costs are getting cheaper. India had 4 launches in 2015, I couldn't get 2016, including 3 of their sort of standardized polar orbit launch. And the Russians are not really in the business very much. They only had 2 launches in 2016. Our company that's coming in next week, Astroscale, we're not sure if the speaker can be here or if he will have to speak to us by video conference because they're launching on November 28th. So November 30th is our next session in the series. And of course, one of the things that hit the launch industry pretty badly was SpaceX. They had a pre-launch on-the-pad explosion that not only messed up the satellites that were in the payload for that launch, but delayed several other payloads from 2016 into 2017. So this year may look better than last year did. The segment of the satellite industries that's really growing, though, is the ground equipment. Now, the network equipment is the old style stuff, the large dish antennas and those kinds of systems. It's the consumer GPS space that has really growth. They were growing 8% in 2016. And this not only includes devices in your car and standalone devices, but it includes the chipsets for global navigation that would be in your cell phone. So, of course, just about every cell phone has these now, and so that market has really grown from $52 billion in 2012 to $84 billion in 2016. Similarly, TV, radio, like broadband, from in 2012 to $18.5 billion. That's actually an interesting problem because the consumer equipment for satellite TV in the last year really topped out, right, from $18.3 to $18.5 billion. Yeah, basically flat. So even though it has not really caused a huge jump in the number of people getting satellite TV. Look at these numbers. It's hard to kind of keep the numbers in context, but if you think about a company like Apple its revenues are probably around 150 to 200 billion a year, right? A company like Intel probably has revenues of 50 or 60 billion a year, if not more. And so you're seeing a relatively small, self-contained industry that has had a few big players. Right now, most of the revenues for space industry private sector companies are coming from government customers. 70% of the revenues. Go back to the presentation by Rick Jaruso in the first session of this series on October 5. And he talked some about this, how the government sector has moved from program-based to really purchasing-based. And you can see this. There was a report for the Congressional Research Service that was done in 2016, and it talked about the shift from cost-plus contracts, where the government decides everything, and the contractor basically is an outsourced provider that gets paid for their costs plus a fixed amount of profit that the government contract allows. More recently, government contracts are more fixed price. They look more like bids where different contractors can propose different total amounts for the bid. And so this encourages competition. It's more like buying off the shelf. The government has less internal control over how the contractor delivers, as long as they meet the specifications. And it does help the contractors get to a more kind of commercial mindset. Just kind of an aside, about 20 years ago, when I was early in this job here at Stanford, I was invited to go to a meeting of the Defense Space Consortium, which were all private companies that were doing space work for the defense industry. So the meeting was over at Loral Space Systems, and I guess there was 50 or 60 people in the room. I don't think any of them knew how to pitch to a VC. Now, granted, this was a long time ago, and VC pitching wasn't as much a part of all of Silicon Valley culture, but people understood extremely well how to respond to government requests for proposal. They hadn't really thought commercially, and I think that's been a big change that we've seen over the last generation. The government is still having kind of some issues. Export controls, ITAR, has been mentioned a number of times. They restrict U.S. companies because of the possible military applications of a lot of the commercial kind of work that satellites can do. The other thing that's really hot right now, and this was big in the Congressional Research Service report, is that as the telecom industry moves toward 5G, some of the frequencies that have been exclusively used for satellite communication are going to be reallocated to ground-based 5G networks around 28 gigahertz or somewhere. And this would make satellite communications more expensive. It makes it more difficult as the amount of data that is going over the satellites is expected to increase. So the governments are still kind of there. Now, you can see the growth of the private sector also through the growth of private sector investments in space. Notice over on the right-hand side of the bar graph, suddenly the venture capital industry jumped in 2015 to a much larger size than it had ever been before. But I have to say that some of this was a few very large deals. In 2015, Google invested $1 billion in SpaceX. That's part of that venture capital bar. In 2016, SoftBank led a consortium of investors to invest $1.2 billion in a company called OneWeb. So there were also a few other $90 million plus deals in 2015 and 2016. If you take away all of those, the VC investments look more like about $260 million, both for 2015 and 2016, which is still at least double the amount that it had been in the previous year of 2014. So you're seeing a definite takeoff in the amount of venture capital funding. If you look up here at this different table, you see that seeds and prizes and grants have also encouraged the startup companies in the space industry. The program we had on October 12th with iSpace was after the $20 million prize offered by Google in the Lunar X Prize. So those have had an impact really at the very early stage, the seed level. Venture capital is big. There are a few wealthy angel investors who are quite active, not only in their own companies, but in looking at other companies. There are now some accelerators that are looking at very early stage companies. Probably the biggest one is Starburst, which has offices in maybe 8 or 10 cities all over the world, including one in Singapore. Another one would be Lightspeed. Lightspeed claims to be the Y Combinator of space startups. So there are more accelerators around now than there used to be. You're also seeing space startups making money through M&A exits. So other companies are buying them out. And there is a little bit of money being made in public offerings, but the biggest, SpaceX, is still a private unicorn. And this there was a lot of debt financing around 2010 or 2011 that I suspect was going into traditional kinds of geoorbit communication satellites. But you're seeing definitely an uptick in the amount of investment that is going into this sector. Of the 250, and this includes banks and all of this, debt offering and so forth, institutions that put money, either equity or debt, into space startups in 2016, 66%, 2/3 of them were from the United States, and 1/3 of them were from other countries. So the U.S. is still the biggest investor in space, but you're seeing a lot of interesting groups in other places that are picking up. We'll talk about a couple of them in a little bit. 9 of the big venture capital firms in Silicon Valley have invested in at least 3 space startups, including a couple of VC firms that have invested in 5. Draper Fisher Jurvetson has invested in 5. I think Bessemer Venture Partners is the other one that invested in 5. So what about Asia? This series is really focusing on Asia. That's kind of the overview of what's going on worldwide. I think that, first of all, Asia governments have been quite heavily developing telecom satellites, to a certain extent GPS services satellites and Earth observation satellites for quite some time, and this is now moving into countries that you might be surprised. So Laos and Myanmar and Bangladesh are in the process of investing in geostationary satellites for telecom. This is a $1 billion investment each time you're trying to put up a satellite. Earth observation satellites have kind of hit national pride. So Taiwan put up its first domestically developed satellite this year. It would have been last year, but it was supposed to go up on the SpaceX rocket that blew up. Incidentally, they got $200 million from SpaceX as payment for the loss of their satellite. And so this, I'm not sure how much of that was paid by insurance to SpaceX. The Philippines have deployed a microsat that was jointly developed by Japan. The satellite itself was developed in the Philippines, but this was the first of a project coming out of 2 Japanese universities that is to put up 50 microsatellites in a constellation with Southeast Asian countries that are for Earth observation. So they're moving on beyond the telecom and really looking at resource management, agricultural management, and forest management, that sort of thing. India took a kind of innovative approach to putting up its regional GPS system. Instead of one geosynchronous satellite, it put up 7 low Earth orbit satellites in a constellation so that they're always handing off the signal as they pass over India. The constellation is already in orbit, but they're still going through final testing. They've had some issues with the satellites in the last few months as they've tested them. There are also quite a few private satellite operators in Asia. Now, most of these are telecom, right? Thaicom has been around for a long time. Measat has been around for a long time. KTSat, the Korean version, has been around since 1970. But there's also Bank Rakyat Indonesia that has put up its own geosynchronous satellite to do banking by satellite. So Indonesia is a huge country that's spread out, and the infrastructure development there has not kept up with the economic development, so the bank decides to put up its own satellite. You also have, from Japan at least, Perfect JSAT, that is a multi-channel pay TV broadcasting satellite. They actually reflect a merger. Sky Perfect bought JSAT. And so this is an interesting player. The Star satellite TV services that you see all over Asia. Does anybody happen to know who has the satellites for that? I'm not sure where they're buying their capacity. So I'm not sure if they're buying it from Sky Perfect or if it's from another provider. In Singapore, it's interesting that you have multiple satellite operators who've put an office in Singapore, even though they're not all from Singapore itself. And you also have one satellite in operation from Singapore that's doing high-resolution imaging, probably for safety and security applications. You remember in our presentation by Axel Space on October 19, they were going to make their resolution no smaller than 2 meters on the surface that they could review from space. There's like a 2-hour pass. You can a particular location in Singapore can be refreshed, I think, every 12 hours, 12 to 16 hours, not 2 hours, but at 1 meter resolution. So that's quite interesting that they actually have that in operation. This is still kind of old-style satellite business, though. The satellite startups are kind of what we've been looking at this quarter at Stanford. I've talked a lot about the ones that we've had already. So this, after the Thanksgiving vacation, when we come back, Astroscale is coming back with a very interesting area. Astroscale is very well funded. They've attracted over $40 million in venture capital already. They're past Series B round in venture capital. Interstellar is an earlier stage. They're really going into Series A right now, but they have a very interesting kind of sharing economy approach to satellite ground stations. They do have some competition from a company in the United States, though. In fact, there's quite a lot of competition among startups. I want to spend a few minutes and talk about the companies we couldn't get. The company that was supposed to be presenting today was Guangxi Space. And I've gone back and forth with them for the last few weeks with phone calls between here and Hong Kong, here in Shenzhen, and here in Israel, where they also have an office. In China, but their investments are not purely portfolio. They're clearly developing kind of strategic relationships for their investments. They invested in a jetpack company and in a high atmosphere balloon company, so not things that are not exactly space as well. I mentioned the Starburst Accelerator earlier. The Singapore office is really a partnership with Leone Capital. It's a $200 million Singapore dollar fund. So that's, there's money for the startups to go there. A couple of companies that we looked at, one from Japan and one from Australia, Singapore, are developing hybrid jet and rocket engines for low-cost launch services, and the one in Japan is really pushing it all the way into suborbital tourism. One Space is a startup in China that's really the Chinese version of SpaceX. And finally, SpaceShift is kind of competition for the CubeSat people. It has its own kits for making your own low-cost microsatellites. And basically, it doesn't help you with the launch services, though. The company that's kind of one of the most bizarre companies you'll ever hear of is AIL Japan. And I just have to show you a little bit of this, because AIL Japan is making artificial meteor showers for entertainment. I'm serious. They send up a microsat. This microsat has thousands of tiny pebble-shaped pieces of metal or pieces of whatever that they release from the satellite to make a meteor shower. These things burn up in the atmosphere just like a meteor shower does. They already have a contract for the 2020 Olympics. And they may actually be able to deliver a meteor shower before then. They're pretty far along. I'm not sure if they've actually launched yet or not, but I think what I love about this company is that they were looking at space not in the traditional kind of areas that people tend to look at space in, but as something that would be really a way to do something totally different. If you talk about the prospects for commercial space businesses from now, I'm not sure how many artificial meteor shower providers the world really needs, but there are some areas in the space business that are really already well established, or they're developing rapidly as we speak. So we've used satellites for weather forecasting for a long time. We've used it for telecom for a long time. Media content providing, the internal to the TV networks, internal to the big TV producers, they've used it for a long time. And now increasingly you're getting satellite TV. Navigation, the GPS business, right? Even supply chain management. Knowing where your ship is on the ocean is something that is done as well by satellite as anything else. Security services are almost all government-sponsored, government clients, but they're there by satellite. And also insurance. Now, you have a lot of kind of space-enabled technologies. Climate Corporation is a very interesting company that was using historical data on crop yield along with historical data on weather patterns and current data information coming from satellite in order to give farmers much lower cost premiums for their crop insurance. So that kind of thing is coming along, but agricultural management is still largely in the future. And one of the things down is drones. Drones are easy to deal with your farm, and if you don't have to deal with an entire large area, that might be good enough. Other environment management, looking at tropical rainforests, the question is who's going to pay? I think that certain government sources will pay for environmental management, and there may be some nonprofits here, but it's an expensive process. The satellites will be a critical part of driverless vehicle management. This is an outgrowth from GPS, of course, but there may be additional kind of satellite-based information coming in with weather, for example, in addition to the information on location of tourism and transport. Okay, people talk about and you can and have your first flight to the moon or whatever. But it's going to be a while before people deliver. I think we've got several years before that. There are a number of companies that are talking about trying to deliver electric power from space, maybe by laser or by even something bizarre like a giant long cable up to a geostationary satellite. Manufacturing in space is a interesting concept that hasn't been, there's been some experiments on the International Space Station, but so far it's very much still just in the experimental stage, very early, very kind of basic research. But of course the absence of gravity and the absence of atmosphere would make space a very interesting place to do various kinds of manufacturing. And finally, mining celestial bodies. Remember, our company iSpace was looking at their rover eventually as something that would help go to the moon and collect water from the polar regions of the moon that would then be used either to support a habitat on the moon or as fuel for for interplanetary travel. Before you say too much crazy about that, the moon is evidently a very good source of the helium-3 isotope, which would be used in advanced fusion propulsion systems. And it's very rare on Earth, and of course if you're already on the moon, you don't have to deal with the great cost of getting out of the Earth's atmosphere and Earth's orbit. So, or it's less costly to get out of Earth orbit. So mining of celestial bodies may happen at some point. There was a very interesting slide that has been developed in the UK that is on the broader impact of satellite services. The slides of this presentation will be up on the web. You don't have to worry about trying to read all of this now. The point to look at now is that they look at, in the outermost ring, alternative solutions. This is something that could be done from the ground or from a satellite, but there may be a value in doing it from a satellite because it's cheaper or more efficient in some way. The middle one, enhancing solutions, are things that are really better done from a satellite than they are done from the Earth. And finally, inside the middle are the enabling solutions that really can't be done without a satellite. So the one that may be easy to read is the weather forecasting, right? Without satellites, we couldn't do it. So this is kind of the case for space in terms of economics. So what about Asia? What's going to drive business in Asia? I think it is an unusual situation of rapid economic growth. Economic growth has slowed down in China, but still economic development has outpaced infrastructure development. We've had 100 years to build up the infrastructure in the United States, and so there are a lot of ideas to leapfrog in Asia. Large areas that really need to be integrated into the cloud of the internet. Also, I think in places like China, the government's desire to lessen the rich-poor gap means helping the economies of the interior regions to really come along. That's likely to really encourage some space-enabled technologies for less developed. Have national pride. I think that came across from Dr. Mohanty's presentation on October 26th, how long India has been involved in space from the early 1960s, and now it's a provider of launch services, it's a developer of satellites. You're probably going to see less reliance in the rest of the world on U.S. and European providers in the future. People will keep the business closer to home. And also, all across Asia, you're seeing government education programs that are really targeting young people studying physics and mathematics, and space is one of those great things to capture the imagination of young people. So a lot of these education programs are helping at the K-12 level, and you have some really serious university space science programs going on in places like the University of Tokyo. That constellation of 50 satellites I mentioned was being done at Tohoku University and Hokkaido University. You see this in National University of Singapore. You see it in the Chinese universities. At this point, they are starting to really become serious about more innovation. And quite a few of the Japanese startups are from people who were involved in those university space programs as students. I think you'll see more of that in other countries in Asia. So, to summarize, commercial space is combining some very well-established application areas with some moonshot things. Think about the history of the airplane. Orville and Wilbur Wright flew their plane in 1903. When did you really see commercial airline services take off? So there were military things going on in World War I, but really it was the mid-20s before commercial airline services really started to do anything serious, airmail and that kind of thing. Sure enough, a lot of their early customers were government customers. We are seeing a shift in the way the government treats space from being something where it's really part of a government program to something where the government needs the space products and they're going to pay the private sector to develop them. It is a robust area for startup creation, although the number of companies is not really that large. The Congressional Research Service estimates that since 2006 in the United States, there are about 8 space-related startup companies created every year. So that's not a huge number, but it's quite, it's a noticeable number, and cumulatively it starts to look like a lot. Now, from the wealthy angels like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, we're really seeing the jump up in VC funding, and that would not happen without really seeing commercial prospects. For the wealthy angels, it could just be a beautiful vision, right? It could be something they really want to change the world for the future, and they've got some extra cash. But for the VCs, they have to pay a return to their investors, and so I think we're really seeing a much more serious commercial attitude towards space development. Asia is part of this recent takeoff. It's really easy to miss what's going on there. Most of what we hear about are things that are going on in the United States. Most of the space startups that I hear about are companies that are in the United States. But I would expect to see a continuing process of interesting innovations, leapfrog technologies, leapfrog business approaches that we might not even think of here because we already have an advanced infrastructure that will come from Asia as well as from other sources. So that's my comments for today. We've got some time. I'd be happy to take your questions. Thanks very much for your attention. Floor is open.
Your last remark about the startups in Asia and we're getting a little slower reminds me of when cell phones came out and we were held back by all those telephone lines and poles, right? And, and Asia could develop directly go to cell phones.
Yeah, that's right. Mobile technologies really developed a lot faster in Asia than they did here because we had a legacy infrastructure that slowed us down.
Right.
Yeah. Good point. Go ahead, Jerry.
Yeah. On your original charts, when you were breaking down the revenues generated, did any part of that represent the defense programs, or
Actually, you have to say that it includes government program revenues as well as the other stuff. So I think that the big picture, the space industries, the non-satellite industry, at somewhere around $120 billion to $80 billion, that's probably all the deep space stuff that NASA is doing and that other governments are doing, as well as ancillary industries like financing and insurance. With government numbers, yeah, there's a lot of what I would call spooky stuff out there, right? A lot of surveillance, a lot of spy business things up in orbit. And you never know how much of that have been folded into the numbers the way that they're captured. The people who are really serious in doing that kind of analysis are also spooky people. And they go through the 500-page U.S. government budget and they can figure things out pretty well. But I think that the commercial sectors, the things that are clearly commercial, are clear enough that that's interesting. So the government question mark, you just have to leave as a question mark.
Well, one of the areas I'm getting into is the fact that the military has a lot of activity in space, for mainly for first order CQ, command communications, and they use a lot of contractors. Now, what I don't know is how much is that revealed.
So the military uses a lot of contractors. This is true. I would guess that the aggregate amounts might very well be revealed. What I would expect not to be revealed are things like the National Reconnaissance Office, NRO, or possibly some of the stuff that some of the other acronym agencies are doing. Yeah, good question. Joe?
I'm curious to see about this development in technology. When back in I think it was in the 90s, I had a contract with a mobile telephone company that was starting satellite, saying, well, we can communicate in the desert by using satellites, and others can't. But one of the things I discovered is that when I was testing it for them, every time I went in a building, it wouldn't work.
Yeah, that's kind of an issue, isn't it?
And so I'm wondering how they overcame that.
I think that what happens now is if you've got a sat phone like in a yacht, there will be an antenna on the outside of the yacht that will be the receiver, and then they'll have some sort of a wireless, communication inside the area. But yeah, satellite phones are still relatively expensive compared to just regular communication. Go ahead, back and back.
I'm just curious, in terms of non-satellite space explorations, are there companies that specialize in like space tourism?
There are companies that say they're aiming towards space tourism. Now, one thing that I didn't really have a chance to put together is all of these areas of future applications. There is a kind of things that are relatively close in and things that are relatively far out. I think that the space tourism is kind of medium to far out. One reason that I say that is not just what I think. If you look at the kind of investments in these companies, they have all developed a business model to use for the next 3 or 4 years, so that space tourism is kind of in the future, their future, they will do this eventually. So it's there, it's kind of the vision, but they need a way to get revenue on the way to developing that business. So I would say, other than a few really kind of just sort of random things, right? 2 or 3 people going to the moon, on what is it, who is it? Is it Blue Origin? No, who is doing this? I can't remember. It's one of Virgin Galactic. Thank you. Yeah, they actually are already offering tickets. So a few random things like that. That's not exactly a sustainable business, I don't think. But if you start at the high end of the market and things start to work, then you move downward into sort of more mainstream markets. So I think that tourism is kind of medium far out. It still tends to be associated with the very wealthy entrepreneurs. The same thing for mining, going up and mining, the moon or asteroids. That's something where the companies talk, and in the meantime, they're getting either continued funding from entrepreneur-type investors or government contracts. A lot of the commercial companies, their first business is really for a government contract. And that also sort of resembles the way the aviation industry developed in the past. Excellent question, thanks. Go ahead, back in the back.
It seems that there is a great demand in satellite phone service. It's so expensive with satellite phone, communicate with satellite phones. So I wonder, you can comment about what's the future prospect in reducing the cost of phone calls by satellite.
Yeah, so is this going to be a real, your question amounts to asking, will increasing use, especially of low Earth orbit satellites in communications, really change the whole kind of architecture of the telephone communications infrastructure? From a central circuit to something that's more network topology, distributed, looks more like the internet than it does like the old traditional broadcasting model. I think we'll definitely see that. I think that even though the satellite costs have gone down, the costs of data storage and processing have gone down even more. 30 years ago, we talked about silicon being free, then we talked about circuits being free, transistors being free, then we talked about chips being free, and then it's really, approaching the point where memory is close to free. And so now all of the data processing that's going on with big data analytics and artificial intelligence is just involved with such a huge amount of data that is there precisely because it's a lot cheaper than it used to be. So the low Earth constellations of satellites are significantly cheaper than geostationary satellites. They're much smaller, it takes less energy to get them up there. And I think that this fits the new topology of the networks. Everything is going IP. And so as that spreads, certainly there's no need for the kind of centralized approach you had when it was really an analog system. So yeah, I definitely see this as part of an ongoing major change in the way information, data is transmitted from place to place. Does that answer your question? Is that what you were getting at?
Is there any business opportunity in this area?
Well, I think that there is, but it's a crowded area, right? First of all, on the data side, you've got these giants like Google, and they're already investing in space. On the other side, quite a few of the satellite companies are really looking at data as the source of their profit more than actually launching the satellite and operating the satellite. It's the data that the satellites are gathering that they see as the source of value. So, yeah, there's business opportunities, but it's getting crowded in a hurry. And it's sort of surprising to see how crowded it is, but I do think there's a big opportunity for, if you just purely say data, right? You find a good use case. The data itself is not interesting. What's interesting is turning it into actionable knowledge. So if you can see patterns from a satellite that you can't see from the ground, or do it in a way that's more cost effective than you can do it on the ground, there's a real business case there. And I think I am seeing lots of new things coming up. Mark?
You put over there driver's vehicle management, and I think you meant about the connected car.
Yeah.
And the connector is coming soon. And my question is, do you think of when will it take off, and what kind of application, and how big it will be? Is it
So
bigger than
that's-
space?
That's really exactly the transition point between navigation, supply chain management, and driverless vehicle management, right? If I were to put it in the thing, it would have to be kind of right in the middle. Very soon, you know, I think that my car is already an IoT system. I mean, people overuse the word IoT, but basically information on the amount of air pressure in the tires is coming to me in the dashboard, and it may even be going back to the car shop. You know, the garage may notice that my car is not performing at its best. Teslas are already doing this. So even with kind of garden variety cars, you're seeing a great deal of not only human communication, but data communication between cars. One of the big questions is, should it be a peer-to-peer network, car to car, or should it be more to a central hub? And on the one hand, peer-to-peer, car to car, is really attractive, except there's still a lot of overhead in the kind of data headers and information that you have to transmit in order to be continually recreating a mesh network. So the mesh networks are higher overhead than the fixed networks in terms of how much data is required. So that slows them down a little bit. But definitely connected car is, depending on how you define it, already starting and will get really big in a hurry.
I see the biggest opportunities in business are coming at the edge network. I mean, more things are going to the satellites, but you can't, that's not efficient to do everything all the way up there and back.
Yeah.
If you can do it halfway, and for local, I mean, automatic vehicles, you don't need to know about what's going on in the US and China, right?
Well, this is actually a really interesting kind of point. The whole sort of IT revolution moved from mainframe terminal, where everything was in the middle, right? And what we really have with the early stages, so it moved from that to client server, where there was a lot more intelligence in the client. And then gradually it moved into cloud computing, where you have anything can be a client. You know, a coffee cup can be a client in the network. The situation with these IoT systems is going through the same sort of thing. Basically dumb sensors with information processing in the cloud. The next set will be network robotics, connected car. And so I think that's equivalent to client server. To go beyond that with IoT systems will require transparency and great human interface so that you don't even know that the processing is going on. We're coming close to that with virtual assistants. You know, Siri's getting better and better. And Alexa, I suppose, is even better. But it hasn't really reached the stage of not noticing the technology yet. So when it does, that will really be a thing. And the role of satellites in that will be how they can contribute to types of analysis and to I would possibly even data storage. You know, that we haven't seen yet. But I think that in this slide, things like manufacturing in space, that's almost like the artificial meteor shower. I mean, that's, okay, maybe not a new industry, but I do think that that would be something new to do in space, right? That we have only tested a few things in laboratory conditions. And if somebody can find that you can make particular kinds of materials, metal alloys, in space due to no gravity and no atmosphere, that are stronger and lighter than we have down here, then people will be starting to do more and more up there instead of just communications. Right now, satellites are all communications and imaging, observation, right? And that would be something new in space. Charlotte.
Oh, I was wondering, I know that maybe a few years back, 10 years, that space launch cost was always the biggest constraint to like everything moving forward, space launch cost. So just the gateway to space. Do you think that's still true, or is there now ample space launch capacity?
So the launch business is something I didn't really look at too much for this one because I was really focusing more on Asia, and the providers in Asia are pretty standard, traditional. What's happened is the miniaturization of satellites has hit the launch industry with multiple satellites being launched in a single launch. So even though there were like 80 or 85 launches last year, they sent up 250 satellites. But that still is expensive. There are a few companies here in the US that have developed much smaller rockets that will take a few, 2 or 3 CubeSats or 2 or 3 other miniature microsatellites up into low Earth orbit, and they think that's going to be cheaper. So they're starting to roll out their services, but the launch business is one where failures tend to be pretty spectacular. And it's still pretty risky. Great question. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. According to your lecture, so the number of the venture capital in Asia is very limited. So in this situation, so should government support the startup company in Asia? So I would like to know your opinion about that.
I think that, again, I would take the precedent of the aviation industry and say that probably the government for a generation, the next generation, will still be a really important customer. And that role as first customer, plus some extra subsidy for R&D, is going to be absolutely critical for the space industry to get off the ground. The costs are such, the risk is such that, yeah, government participation is essential. Now, what the government has done is they've moved themselves into a customer role and out of the role of we're doing it, but you just do what we tell you to. Encouraging more competition, encouraging kind of this, startup innovation is definitely a good thing. But if you look at Axel Space, talking with our speaker after the presentation a few weeks ago, their biggest source of income is government contracts in Japan, right? Microsatellites. So the government needs a microsatellite. Instead of doing it ourselves, we'll give some business to Axel Space. To the extent that Axel Space has some competitors in Japan, and it does, this company Spaceshift is also making, microsats. PD Aerospace has got some ideas for this kind of an area. Then it's not necessarily the government just giving money to one company, right? So I do think that the new roles of the governments are good to the extent that it fosters competition. But yeah, we would not have an aviation industry if it hadn't been for dozens of years of really government work at the beginning. Even now, there are some airline flights that continue mainly because they carry the mail. The passengers are sort of, extra profit. Good question.
Question regarding Earth observation and getting the data down and everything. And I was just during the last today and yesterday, there has been a conference going on in that Levi Stadium with the Korean folks, and I was there, and then they had a guy from Orbital Insights. You may know that company was their team.
Yeah.
Okay, with digital globe and
Right.
you know, around the world. And also because Korea, South Korea will probably be the first 5G country, ubiquitous 5G everywhere. So they're talking about what Orbital Insights is doing, and the guy from Orbital Insights was talking about the well, you know, what's happening now, and in maybe a couple of years there'll be almost every a revisit of a scene every 2 or 3 months or so, and more and more, and then finally in 10 years, the real-time, high-definition videos. And that can be used well by South Korea and anyone else with 5G.
Yeah.
But my question that did come up, it wasn't good or well answered, is that should that be real-time high-resolution video, let's say at 1 meter resolution, should that be classified?
Okay, so your question is especially the U.S. company Orbital Insights, which is a pretty well-known startup company in space in the U.S., does Earth observation. They're developing high resolution that will start off being not in real time, but eventually will be high res in real time. Should it be secret or not? This is a big problem because it's not just the U.S., it's not just Korea. Privacy regulations in Europe are much more severe, and those countries are really hard to separate from each other, and they don't all follow exactly the same regulation. So I think that we're going to hit data privacy in this space, in this sector, as well as we do just in cloud computing, things like Facebook and Google that are already having trouble. Yeah, this is going to be a real issue for these high-resolution photographs. Who should be able to see it, right? What kind of commercial application should you be able to do? So, for example, if your high-resolution video shows you and the family getting into a car with, you know, some luggage on top of the car, do you all of a sudden start to get advertisements from hotels? You know, that I can see how a lot of the people would think of how to create value around this, but this is something that has not been sufficiently addressed. We really need harmonization of standards and regulations because the data flow across the internet is kind of borderless. You can put up filters and you can put up walls to a certain extent, but generally speaking, that disadvantages the people in your region. So we really have to see how this is going to play out. Good question. Go ahead, Jerry.
Maybe returning to the kind of the funding side of the formula, do you see any potential for SBIRs helping out startups in the future in the space industry?
Well, SBIR grants, Small Business Innovation Research grants, have been around for a long time. In the United States, any agency that conducts research and development activities must set aside 3% of its R&D budget for Small Business Innovation Research grants. And I think STTR, Science and Technology Transfer Research or something, which is eligible, which universities are eligible for, also kind of fit into that pool. SBIR grants have funded an awful lot of startup companies, some of which have gone on to get regular funding and do very well in the U.S. Other countries are imitating them. There are various versions of SBIR grants in countries around Asia now. And so, yes, this is a kind of government subsidy that is typically a relatively small amount of money that is has relatively few strings attached. And this does help start something up. But the danger with an SBIR grant, 20 years ago when I visited the Defense Space Consortium, there was a company that had been in existence for over 12 years, one SBIR grant to the next. And they just never could figure out how, or never tried to figure out how to do a commercial product. They were too good at writing grant proposals. So there is a certain, you have to be careful about that mechanism too. But it's interesting how this chart, they actually show seeds and prizes and grants as a particular line of funding. SBIR would fit into that, along with things like the Google X Prize. They didn't specifically say angel investing. I think they lumped that in with the venture capital. The report goes on to talk a lot about angel investing and what the investors are doing. And of course, private equity tends to be an order of magnitude bigger than venture capital and is really for a more established company that has a sudden need for a very high upfront infusion of capital. So yeah, the grants are definitely part of it.
A couple of years ago, there was a pot of money for SBIRs to support STEM education.
Yeah.
Substantial amount. And it went underutilized because...
Well, part of that is the education sector is not used to that kind of funding. The engineering sector of the world is much more familiar with how to go after some grant money to build something. And I think over on the humanities and sciences side, you're too used to research support rather than commercialization support. But yes, there have been work on STEM. It would be interesting to find out how many of the existing space startups in the United States had started with an SBIR grant. I would guess probably at least 50% of them, maybe more. That's a huge, just complete guess though. So I don't know if it's pouring down rain outside, what's going on, but we do have some refreshments. They're either in the hallway or they're right outside. And we'll finish up the formal section of the program now, but I would love to talk to you some more afterward, and please feel free to talk to each other. That's why we all get together for this. Thank you very much for coming today.